The room had already decided the future before she ever lifted her hand. Rows of polished desks, chalk dust floating in stale air, and a blackboard covered in symbols that had defeated the greatest mathematical minds for generations. The professor stood confidently, almost comfortably, announcing that the problem before them was not meant to be solved. Not today. Not in their lifetime. Maybe not for 200 years. It was an academic performance meant to remind everyone who knowledge belonged to and who it did not. Then in the back row, a black girl raised her hand. At first, no one reacted. Then someone laughed. Then the room erupted, not with curiosity, but disbelief. What followed would fracture reputations, expose buried prejudice, and force an institution confront a truth it had avoided for centuries. Backhand index pointing right before we continue. Take a moment to share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Stories, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Her name rarely appeared on lists meant to highlight brilliance. She did not come from a family of scholars whose names echoed through academic halls. She was not groomed in elite preparatory schools or introduced to mathematics through private tutors with international reputations. Her journey into numbers began quietly, almost invisibly, in a place no one in that lecture hall had ever bothered to imagine. She grew up in a neighborhood where ambition was treated like a risk and curiosity like a distraction. Schools are focused more on discipline than discovery. Textbooks were outdated. Resources were thin. Expectations were thinner. Teachers learned early not to expect excellence, especially not from black girls who were quietly steered toward practicality instead of possibility. Yet numbers spoke to her in a way the world did not. They were consistent, honest. They did not judge tone, hair, or background. They simply existed, waiting to be understood. She learned early that brilliance, when wrapped in black skin, often needed permission to breathe. She learned to stay quiet when she knew the answer, to shrink her certainty into something palatable. She learned that confidence could be mistaken for arrogance and curiosity for defiance. But math remained unchanged. It rewarded patience. It rewarded obsession. It rewarded those willing to sit with discomfort until clarity emerged. By the time she reached the university, she had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. She dressed plainly. She spoke little. She sat in the back, not because she lacked confidence, but because experience had taught her that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny rarely came with fairness. The institution itself carried prestige like a shield. Its stone buildings, ivy-covered walls, and long corridors whispered centuries of intellectual dominance. It was the kind of place where history was not just taught, it was protected. The mathematics department was its crown jewel, known globally for theoretical breakthroughs that shaped economies, technologies, and wars. Its faculty were not just educators. They were gatekeepers of knowledge. And gatekeepers, by design, decide who passes through. The lecture that day was not part of the standard course. It was a special session, announced with a kind of dramatic reverence. Students had been told to attend not to learn, but to witness. The professors framed it as an intellectual demonstration, an exploration of a problem so complex that it had resisted resolution for generations. They spoke of it like a monument, untouchable, unmovable, sacred. The problem itself had a history. It originated in abstract theory, where numbers behave less like tools and more like concepts with personalities. Over decades, mathematicians had chipped away at it, proving small pieces, confirming assumptions, but never breaking through. Journals referenced it with a kind of resigned admiration. It had become a symbol not of failure, but of patience, proof that some knowledge simply required time. Or so they said. The professors filled the front of the room with confidence. Their voices carried authority shaped by tenure, citations, and awards. They explained the boundaries of the problem carefully, outlining why it resisted solution. They listed names of famous scholars who had tried and failed. Each name served as reinforcement, a reminder that even the best minds could not conquer this terrain. What they did not say, what hovered invisibly in the room, was that the demonstration had another purpose. It reinforced hierarchy. It reminded students who was meant to observe and who was meant to contribute. It established that brilliance belonged to those already standing at the front. The black girl listened quietly, her notebook untouched. She had seen the problem before, not in a journal, not in a lecture, but late at night, scrolling through obscure research forums, chasing questions that no syllabus had assigned. She had not tried to solve it directly. Instead, she had studied its edges, its assumptions, the way people spoke about it as if it were untouchable. She had noticed something others had dismissed, but she said nothing. Not yet. As the lecture continued, the atmosphere shifted from explanation to performance. The professors were no longer teaching. They were reinforcing inevitability. They emphasized the limitations of current methods, the impossibility of approaching the problem with existing frameworks. Each sentence narrowed the space for imagination. Students responded as expected. Some leaned back, resigned. Others scribbled notes they knew would never be used. A few nodded reverently, absorbing not knowledge, but hierarchy. This was how academic power functioned. Through quiet consensus, the black girl felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation she had learned to recognize as the moment where silence demanded obedience. She had experienced it before, in classrooms where teachers skipped her raised hand, in group projects where her ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else, in conferences where her presence was mistaken for support staff rather than scholarship. But this time was different. The problem on the board was not sacred. It was flawed, not in its complexity, but in the way it had been framed. The assumptions that supported its unsolvability were treated as truths, when they were, in fact, conveniences. Everyone accepted them because challenging them required stepping outside tradition, and tradition had never been kind to outsiders. She had spent months questioning those assumptions, not because she believed she could solve the problem, but because something about the narrative surrounding it felt wrong. Too final, too comfortable. Unsolvability had become part of its identity, and identities once fixed were rarely interrogated. Her realization had come slowly, through frustration and doubt. She had abandoned the problem more than once, convinced she was missing something obvious. But each time she returned, the same pattern emerged. The obstacle was not the mathematics itself. It was the lens through which it was viewed. The professor spoke as if the problem demanded a specific kind of mind, one shaped by centuries of European mathematical tradition. But she approached it differently. Her thinking was not constrained by reverence. She was not invested in protecting legacy. She was simply trying to understand. As the lecture reached its climax, one professor smiled knowingly and declared that the problem served as a reminder of humility. Some truths, he said, were not meant to be reached yet. He spoke of patience as virtue, of waiting for future generations. That was when her hand rose. At first, it was barely noticeable, a quiet gesture in a room trained to ignore her. The professor continued speaking, eyes scanning the room, passing over her without pause. Then someone nearby noticed. A whisper traveled. Heads turned. The professor stopped. He looked at her hand, then at her face, confusion flickering briefly before being replaced by amusement. The room reacted almost immediately. Laughter bubbled from the back. Someone scoffed. Others exchanged glances that mixed curiosity with disbelief. This was not outrage. It was dismissal. The professor hesitated, then acknowledged her with a tone that suggested indulgence rather than respect. He assumed she had a question. Clarification, perhaps confusion. She did not lower her hand. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that precedes judgment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. She did not announce certainty. She did not claim brilliance. She simply stated that one of the foundational assumptions was unnecessary, and that removing it changed the problem entirely. The eruption was immediate. Some laughed louder. Others protested. A few professors exchanged looks that suggested irritation. The idea that a student, especially one who looked like her, could challenge centuries of consensus felt offensive, not intellectually, but culturally. One professor dismissed her point without addressing it. Another reframed it inaccurately, then rejected the reframing. The room seemed eager to move on, to restore order. But something had shifted. She did not argue. She did not defend herself aggressively. She simply repeated her observation, calmly, precisely. She referenced work few in the room recognized. She explained how the assumption functioned more as tradition than necessity. Silence returned, Heavier this time. The professors attempted to regain control, but the confidence that had filled the room earlier had thinned. One of them approached the board, re-examining the equations. Another flipped through notes. Their body language changed, not to curiosity, but to discomfort. The students noticed. This was no longer a performance. It was an interruption. The turning point did not arrive with applause or validation. It arrived with resistance. The professors pushed back harder now, not because her logic was flawed, but because accepting it would require humility they were unprepared to show publicly. They questioned her sources. They questioned her methodology. They questioned her understanding. What they did not question, what lingered unspoken, was her right to speak at all. Yet mathematics does not bend to authority. It does not care about reputation, gender, or race. It only responds to consistency. And her reasoning was consistent. One professor attempted to demonstrate why her approach failed. Halfway through, he stopped. The chalk hovered in his hand longer than necessary. He adjusted his glasses. The room watched as he retraced his steps. He had made the same assumption she had challenged. Another professor joined him. Then another. The board filled with revisions. The audience leaned forward, sensing something rare unfolding. This was no longer about a student questioning authority. It was about authority confronting its own blind spots. Time stretched. Minutes passed unnoticed. The energy in the room shifted from dismissal to tension. No one laughed now. No one whispered. When the realization finally settled, it did not explode. It collapsed inward. The problem had not been solved completely, but it had been cracked. A pathway had emerged where none was supposed to exist. Not a solution, but a beginning. And beginnings in mathematics were everything. The professors stepped back, stunned. One of them finally acknowledged that her observation was valid. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was undeniable. The room erupted, not with laughter this time, but with shock. For the first time, the narrative had changed. The problem was no longer untouchable. The future had arrived early. Carried not by centuries of tradition, but by a black girl who refused to accept inevitability. The aftermath was slow and complicated. Institutions do not change easily, especially when confronted with their own bias. The professors did not immediately celebrate her. Some minimized the moment. Others reframed it as collaborative discovery. Credit was debated quietly behind closed doors. But the damage to the old narrative was irreversible. Her work began circulating. Researchers revisited the problem with new eyes. Papers were written. Conferences referenced the shift without always naming its source. Yet within the department, within the walls where hierarchy had once felt absolute, something had cracked. She did not become famous overnight. She did not receive instant validation. But she gained something more important, visibility that could no longer be denied. Her presence disrupted expectations. Black students saw themselves reflected in possibility. Faculty were forced to confront assumptions they had never questioned. The problem that was once deemed unsolvable became a symbol not of patience, but of perspective. And the lesson echoed far beyond mathematics. Brilliance is not rare. Recognition is. What had erupted that day was not just a room. It was a myth. The myth that genius looks a certain way. The myth that progress must wait for permission. The myth that history moves only forward, never sideways. She had raised her hand, and the world had been forced to look. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see brilliance differently, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel Black Voice Stories. Because stories like these are not just history. They are reminders of who we become when we finally listen.